Hey everyone, welcome back to the Meme Team podcast, where we discuss viral pop culture moments in movies, TV, music, tech, and politics. I'm your host, Sonia Bashez, and today we're discussing Zuckerberg's 6,500-word manifesto about democratizing AI, Bumble scrapping the women message first rule that defined their entire brand, Obama launching a podcast about reading, and the FAA hitting record hiring numbers by recruiting video gamers as air traffic controllers. This week, I'm joined by Jonathan K. Lowe, founder and CEO of Salt Foundry, a collective of fractional chief marketing officers that provides strategy and leadership for growing brands. Jonathan's also the author of the best-selling book, Keeping People Interested: How Leaders Use Marketing to Capture and Sustain Attention. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Sonia. Excited to be here.
Awesome. Okay, so let's dive right into it. So yesterday, Zuckerberg published this huge manifesto arguing that everyone should have access to superintelligence, positioning Meta as the open, democratic alternative to paywalled AI. He tied it to the Industrial Revolution using his own family examples of how he's using AI, and then took direct shots at other AI companies, especially those that have more of a doom framing without naming names. And it's interesting because obviously OpenAI published their own manifesto back in June, which kind of had similar language, which is that AI should belong to everyone and not just a small number of institutions. So obviously some of that message is getting around to all the CEOs of the company. But then on July 27th, Altman declared that we're in the singularity and it's going to be incredibly, hugely positive, awesome for the world. 4 days after that, it got out that his AI escaped containment and autonomously hacked Hugging Face. Anthropic, meanwhile, has gotten caught in investor meetings saying that their pivot to healthcare is designed to mitigate the increasingly negative public sentiment against the industry. They're basically positing that figuring a miracle cure or two would certainly do wonders to turn things around. That's all being said while all three of them are headed towards IPOs or, funding rounds. And it's just been interesting to think about how, Dario at Anthropic has been pretty, I'd say pretty vocal about the doomerism side of things. And then each of the CEOs has in some way kind of talked about, AI affecting things negatively, whether that's jobs being lost or changes happening that, might in terms of like privacy and security. Obviously right now Meta has several high profile cases against Facebook and Instagram and how the algorithm works. There's a couple cases like in California. I think one was just announced in New Mexico that is essentially gonna change how the platform works. And the FTC is currently appealing a ruling against Meta for what they called a buy or bury scheme, essentially saying that it's trying to be a monopoly. So when Zuckerberg is talking about open and free internet and open and free AI, at what point does that come up against what they actually do in public? So Jonathan, have you seen this manifesto? Did you read it? I know it was long, but would love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to read through the manifesto, but it's just such an interesting idea of the democratization of technology, right? And I think philosophically, most of us would agree that that is great in ideals. But the question is, how do you practically bring that to be? And, if you look at public utilities, right, is it really the government itself that ends up creating the infrastructure, or do they subcontract and then make everything accessible? So I would say there's no easy answers here. But obviously, you want the folks who can build the tech be the leaders, but you also want some sort of governmental oversight. So the people, right, we have some sort of a say in where the technology goes and how it affects our everyday lives.
Yeah, I think that's the huge battle we're seeing play out, right? Where, data centers, how AI is being used to capture intelligence, whether through books, right? That was a huge story that came out, I think last week or the week before, about Anthropic destroying books because it had to, it was trying to read them all.
Yep.
read through them. And then you get into the, well, it was necessary because legal copyright says that they have to destroy the books. So how much of it is it really that they're doing it because of the intelligence models that they're trying to build versus the legal landscape that they find themselves in and trying to stay on the right side of the law? But, we're seeing those battles play out in communities every day, right? With AI data centers being challenged. I saw, part of what came out after the manifesto was this article in The Verge where journalist Elizabeth Lopatto was pointing out a couple tells from Zuckerberg's examples about how, he was giving examples of how he uses AI at home, where he's working with his daughter who she's coding programs by herself. But he mentions this moment of like finding baking recipes because they're baking together. And, the journalist pushes back and says, like, why is this something that you would go to AI for? Why isn't this something you would try to curate yourself and go and like have that be part of the process? And this happened recently too with Sam Altman saying that one of the best examples of AI that he's seen is that you create podcasts based on your children's likes, right? To kind of form conversation with them in the car while you're driving. And most of the people that, pilloried him for it, right? Saying, why aren't you having these conversations with your kid instead of, handing it off to the AI? And I think it's this very interesting, pushback that's happening. There's others example today that actually really annoyed me because this guy for Axios said that he went on vacation, he started reading the classic book, Brand New Worlds, and how he used AI to help him create sort of like a reading guide for himself so that he understood the characters and the themes of the book. And, you have journalists coming out there saying like, the societal brain rot of like, people that can't like read a book or admitting that they can't read a book without AI. And it's just like one of those things where it's like the man admitted that this was a book that he would have read on his own. So is it not better for him to try to read the book? Is this not like the like we had what were those Cliff Notes, right? We had Cliff Notes books for the longest time to help people learn the themes and all that, right? And I just think people kind of take things too far where it's like you can't imagine a way that you would use the product in the same way that these people are. So then you just like get really negative about it instead of trying to be open to the idea that some people need more help than others to do things that wouldn't. So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know how much you use AI in your personal or professional life, but are those things that like you think about?
Absolutely. So I wouldn't consider myself an expert on AI, but my undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering. I've always worked very closely, with developers through the years of my career. And I was part of an AI startup for a year as well. And so I definitely have thought through, wrestled through some of the philosophical and practical implications of artificial intelligence. It is a tool I use fairly regularly, but I also recognize the concerns people have both around the practical implications of the impact in the environment, as well as philosophically, the implications around how do we end up teaching? How do we end up thinking? Are we going to lose the ability to think critically because the machine's doing it for us? Now, my overall perspective is that I am optimistic about tools such as artificial intelligence. I take just a broader, view of history and technology. And I have this perspective that many of us, especially who are privileged enough, anybody who's listening to this podcast, right, is living better than kings 200 years ago.
Yeah.
We have better water, better healthcare, better shelter, right? More access to community and people. It's not that we always take advantage and leverage technology in the healthiest ways, right? And that is one of the criticisms of companies like Meta and the way that they leverage their algorithm to hook people in. But is my life better because I found out about my high school reunion through Facebook? Is my life better because, through the years, I was able to connect and have community and leverage the marketplace to sell items and buy used items and recycle, items instead of buying brand new, right? Like, are there elements of technology that are better? I think generally, yes, right? And many of the people who have been afraid of artificial intelligence and how that's going to affect the way that we think and affect the next generation, I agree. I applaud that sentiment. But also, don't we think that something like artificial intelligence is fairly analogous to mobile phones, to the internet? Let's go all the way back to the calculator. I assume that teachers back in the day were freaking out that calculators existed because we thought
Mhm.
students would no longer figure out how to do math in their
Mhm.
head. And maybe I can't multiply 17 by 13 as well as somebody 30 years ago, but are we solving more complicated issues?
Mhm.
Right? Are because of calculators were we able to invent things like such as the internet? Because of the internet were we able to invent, all sorts of create industries and innovations and advancements that make our lives better. I do think healthcare is a very practical, application
Mhm.
that AI was already helping detect, cancer earlier than ever before. Right. And there will be more cases like that. When we think about energy consumption and water usage,
Mhm.
which really hits near to home because of the Utah data center debate, right?
Mhm.
Do we think that potentially a tool such as AI might create more solutions for clean, renewable energy? I'm
Mhm.
generally optimistic that it will, while also recognizing that the application of technology has not always been for the better for mankind, right? There will always be those who are leveraging things selfishly and leveraging
Mhm.
things for their own gain without, thought to others and community and the good of others and the environment. I recognize that. But generally, I think that technology is good for us.
Yeah, that's one of the things I actually really appreciated about Zuckerberg's manifesto is how much he was able to both tie it back to previous examples of the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution and how humanity changed significantly because of the technological progress that came from those eras, and then all the innovations that kind of stemmed from it. He mentioned how, we were then able to create food in a faster way, and how that made cities grow, and then from like the cities growing, like all the innovations that came from that. So I like that he was able to put that in a historical context. I also liked that he's able to speak about AI in a way that wasn't just that doomerism, right? I think part of Dario Amode's problem with how he's talking about AI and Anthropic and Claude is that, he keeps mentioning that lawyers and accountants, they're all going to lose their jobs because AI is going to take them, without making it seem as if, without pushing also forward that we don't know what sort of new jobs are going to get created because of the advent of AI. And I'm more of a, abundance or growth mindset type person where it's like we don't even know what jobs are going to get created from this. Even right now, like my job has completely changed. I'm able to work with more clients, work more in depth in ways that I couldn't before because of AI. And I really think it's both up to the individual, yes, to decide how they want to do it, but it's also for us as society to have these discussions and actually try to get to the point of like how is it that it's going to benefit society and like the humans that are also getting displaced by the water, and and that, yes, the salary and all that I get, but not just also I think part of what I'm trying to say is like I see a lot of these discussions happening, and like the immediate thing is you just want to shut it down, instead of trying to like get to the point. I mean, there's been a couple of high profile like artists or creative, one of them being Hank Green, right, that came out a couple weeks ago saying that he used AI to help him research, which is like one of the best use cases for AI, right? If he uses that as a way to do more or try to do more. And his fans came out and just completely like got him to apologize and take back, what he was doing or the project he was working on, because he now felt uncomfortable in how he was kind of, putting himself out there, but then also how his fans were seeing him. And I think that's one issue. The other one is the discussion that we're having now about data centers, right? Like you have a lot of misinformation happening about what a data center actually means, like for the community, right? And we're starting to see some journalists like push back and put out the facts about how much property tax is being funneled back into the community. How I think there was an example this week in South Carolina. Where like the town has seen, immense growth and like prices are skyrocketing for rents and food and everything because the community is now bringing in a whole bunch of workers that are trying to work at the data center. So I think that we need to be having these nuanced conversations about that. My one thing though is like, should Facebook and should Anthropic, should OpenAI be the ones having these like, discussions by themselves without having any other people that are also on the side of optimism speak to how these companies should be providing for the communities that they're trying to go into?
That is a tricky question. I would imagine if they were wise, they are seeking counsel, right?
Hmm.
And, I've worked at multi-billion dollar organizations that do a lot of research and are really trying to get at the core of what problems we're trying to solve. Now, I realize that's not always true. And
Hmm.
when we're busy and when we're in our own worlds, we're just trying to make decisions in advance. But I do think it is important. And that's why it's actually helpful for these companies to post manifestos so we know what they're thinking. Now, I also am not naive enough to believe that everything they say is exactly what they practice, whether or not they intend to or not, right? It's just when you're managing a multi-billion dollar company, you will not know everything that's going on, but that's where
Hmm.
vision and culture come into play. Now, should they be getting feedback from the general public and government officials and other companies and nonprofits? Absolutely, yes. Now, practically, what might that look like? I'm really not sure.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, and I think that that's a thing that all of us, should kind of think about. And I think particularly, marketers who on both sides, right? Like I've met marketers who are just like, no, I don't use AI at all. And then I've met the marketers who are like, oh my God, it's changed everything that I do and how I do it. But yeah, figuring out how to have those conversations, especially as our own work gets affected, right? I've seen a couple anecdotes of people saying that as soon as they see a company use AI, or both like to write or in images, they're like, that completely turns me off from the company. So I think us
Hmm.
as marketers have to know where our audience stands, because we're going to be affected if we do use AI and our audience hates it. But on the flip side, like if our audience expects us to use it because we're saying that we're like tech forward and AI forward and everything, and you're not using it to the best of the ability, or it just looks so fake, then that's also detrimental to your product and service or whatever it is that you're trying to promote. So there's definitely that nuance there. But I think it comes down to the individuals of like, well, what is it that you think from your community? How is your audience going to react? What are these things that you can do and say that puts you right in front of your target audience? So that's a lesson for me. One of the other lessons is this whole idea of, is this just rhetoric? This whole idea of democratic access. Is it the whole idea of like farm to table or organic, where it gets labeled as this elite thing in order to get people of that tier to recognize what it is? But will it play out that way when it turns out that an open source model isn't the most profitable, And I think that that's something that like we need to think about when we are marketing ourselves and putting this messaging out there, to not use such lofty language that it'll come back and bite us in the ass when it doesn't turn out that way in the future. And obviously, Meta can always say that like, this is where we were at that point and now we have to go in this direction. Or maybe it is true that for them, because they are doing more consumer models or straight to individuals, as opposed to Anthropic that's doing more, enterprise sales or, company to company. it makes more sense for Meta to own we're, here for democratic access. So that's a way to kind of think about how you're positioning yourself against your competitors, in order to show people what the differences are between the two of you.
And I do believe that words matter. And again, I recognize and I'm not naive enough to believe that everyone who says what they are going to do actually follows through. And we see this in politics very often. And, large corporations, whether or not they will admit it, are political, beings. And they, what they say has effects on the broader society as well as their own companies. But what you say does matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think, as a marketer, I have a few different kind of strong opinions about AI because I have used it as a tool. And I think that's what it is for us, at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are these broader implications, but just like an analytics dashboard or a word processor or the laptop that we're on, right? Artificial intelligence and the applications of those products are tools. And so we can use them for good or we can use them for bad, just
Mm-hmm.
like we can use marketing for good or use marketing for bad. Again, I try to take the
Yeah.
generally optimistic view that the
Mm-hmm.
purpose of a company is to add value to the world. And I think that just by the nature of the fact that a company exists, that they're selling products means they are adding value so much that somebody's willing to trade money for their
Mm-hmm.
product or service. There's some exchange of value. There's some value creation. Again, I recognize some products in the world are maybe not the best for people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of more complex factors. But broadly speaking, you can use AI for good then. As a marketer, for example, I support one of my clients is a really great nonprofit called Warrior Rising that is veteran entrepreneurs who have created programs and support to help other veteran entrepreneurs grow their businesses.
Mm-hmm.
And I have saved hours of my life and improved quality on data analytics because I've gathered data and then I leverage a tool in Claude to help me find and analyze what's working and what's not and
Mm-hmm.
create charts. It helps me find implications. And
Mm-hmm.
I've saved hours and gleaned a lot of insights that have helped a cool organization like Warrior Rising grow, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the application of the tool is very important.
One of the huge ways that I use it is having that data visualization, right? Because I see things in my head, but I can't actually do it myself. So it's easier to speak to the AI to get that, to come out. And then people, that are more visual in that sense can see the data in a way that they never would have thought of before and then make decisions based off that. So totally agree that there's like ways to use tools. And I think that's one thing I did like about how he talked about, AI in his manifesto is talking about AI as a tool and how it can do things. And he went through like a variety of examples in healthcare, science, and using it in that way. So overall, I do think that the messaging is good. I think from a comm standpoint, how we're kind of um positioning ourselves and talking about those vision statements matter. The only pushback I'd say is that it was never put in the context, and of course he doesn't want to put it in the context of Facebook, or Meta, and Instagram and everything that's happening, legally. But it did make me question throughout, like, is Facebook the best company to be doing this when we know how they have reacted with social media, which is that their business model is always going to win and they're always going to put the profits ahead, regardless of the societal wrong, or bad that it's done. But I mean, that's a thing that should be discussed by all of us going forward. Awesome. Okay, we can move on to topic number 2. We talk a lot here about branding and what it means to, position yourself and differentiate yourself from your competitors. And Bumble is changing what made the brand its brand. And so this is after the CEO left. And so the current board and CEO are deciding to reverse its signature mechanic of women messaging first. Now they're going to allow men to make that first move. And it's very interesting to think about it now, where it's like, is this the only way to save the company? Or is it losing the main thing that made it what it was? you know? And I was thinking about this because I just flew up to San Francisco and back using Southwest. And it was the first time that I had to fly with assigned seating as opposed to, open seating. And that was like a very big thing that we talked about last year where, Southwest got rid of not only the assigned seating, but the free checked bags. And now you have to pay for bags and you have to, choose a seat and pay for that, right? And at the time I said that, I expected it to blow up in their faces because, all the other airlines are doing the same thing. But I went and I looked at the numbers and apparently the stock is up 23% year to date. Their revenue hit a record 8.4 billion, up 16.4%. And their own research is saying that 80% of customers prefer assigned seating, and that open seating was the number one reason that customers left for their competitors. So sounds like that's essentially killing it for them, right? Where now it's like they're winning, following what every other brand is doing, because their customers wanted that. And then the ones who didn't want that, like me, were in the minority. So I'll be curious to see how it, comes out with Bumble, whether this is going to be a thing that helps save the business or if they're, gonna end up failing. I think part of what I had been thinking about is how much it means, I guess, societally, how much has changed from when Bumble launched. And this was like heralded as like the way for, women to take the first move. And then realize how much of it is changing now that like, it seems as if younger demographics are a bit more, traditional and want to have, more of those like gender roles played out. And this is one of those examples. So Jonathan, did you see this? Would love to know your thoughts in terms of both brands changing or, it like working or not.
Yeah, well, and to bridge our topics a little bit too, I do really believe that in the age of AI, what's really going to make the difference for companies is their brand, their
Mm-hmm.
marketing, their storytelling, and how
Yeah.
human they feel and how they're able to actually have empathy and connect with customers.
Mm-hmm.
And so storytelling becomes critically important because the barriers to creating functional products is, so significantly reduced. You can vibe code a workable like web app or mobile app very quickly now that it's being commoditized. Now that's what's also interesting about dating apps is it a commodity now,
Mm.
right? And it's also interesting to intersect considering the growth stages of companies because for a startup, because Bumble is not the first dating app, right?
Mm-hmm.
Facebook was not the first social media platform. But at the stage of a startup, it's very important to niche and to have a strong brand that stands for something that's memorable, that's unique, that does something just a little bit differently, that's understandable, right? And for Bumble, it was really powerful because they leveraged their branding and storytelling in a way that empowered women and caught that need, recognized that no one else was doing that, and was able to find a niche to get to a certain stage of growth. Now, with so much other competition, and this I think is a similar parallel with both Southwest and even Facebook, users expect more and more features, right? And it
Mm-hmm.
actually is very important to understand what your customers are seeking and desiring in the product set. And so if, for example, Southwest did and understood the research that, hey, for the majority, no longer is this a feature, it's almost a bug. Well, can we shift that? But can we still have a unique brand identity and a unique, for example, point-to-point system rather than, the hub system of other airlines? What really differentiates the brand and what even allows you to scale greater, right? If
Mm-hmm.
Facebook only ever forever limited itself to universities,
Mm-hmm.
it absolutely would not, be the behemoth that it is today, and its impact on society would be lower than, again, arguably whether or not this is good or bad. Their impact to society would be smaller than they would have desired. And so it doesn't make sense for a brand like Bumble, who got a lot of brand recognition for a specific core feature, to change that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have all the data, but I could see where they're coming from.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, this isn't the first change that Bumble has tried. They've, gone into, Bumble women to women in terms of like creating, being a friendship app, right? For
Hmm.
women,
Bumble
which
BFF.
obviously, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they had different, verticals that they could expand into. But the main, product of dating, of their dating app has seemingly just started failing more and more compared to, Tinder and, Hinge and all those, which also have their own type of, brand persona that I think of them as, right? So this seems to be, I mean, I don't want to say it's the last recourse, but obviously I think, much like Southwest, where, if it's a thing that you're finding out that people, actively detest or aren't using to the utmost, then like what really is the point of keeping it other than slowly dying, a slow
Hmm.
death, I guess, but and I think it's there's also a lot to be said about you as like the in-house team kind of figuring out what these changes are, right? I think another example, right, that recently came to the fore was the Cracker Barrel like branding change, right? Where it's like they were trying to update their brands and
Hmm.
the restaurants and stuff. And the CEO was just fired after a year because it ended up being a massive failure. And so, us as marketers, right, we always have these ideas of like, oh, obviously, Cracker Barrel should have kept its, brand and the storytelling, everything it was doing, because that's what people, were going there for. Whereas like with Bumble, it makes sense that the main goal that they're trying to achieve is getting people to date, right? It's not that they have to date in a specific way, which is that women have to reach out to men. And I think it makes sense where it's like when you break it down to what it is that your ideal customer is coming to you for, then how do you help them achieve that, right? And if it means removing all like, the kitschiness or, this thing that you thought was the main reason people were coming to you for, then I think that that's an okay thing for you to do, when you have to, and I think it is going to play out to Bumble's favor, because if you're going back to what their main goal is to get people to date and want to, use their app, then like, the having women have to communicate first isn't that main thing. And then obviously they might lose some of
Yeah.
their, hardcore fans, like that's fine. But I think in terms of serving everybody else and then where we are now, I mean, societally, things have changed from when Bumble first came out. Then it's like you have to meet your user where they are now and not keep things where they used to be because that's what worked for you back when you first came out. And I think it's okay for companies to recognize that and think about, well, where are we now? How do we serve our current target user and current target new users? And like, what is it that they expect and what is it they want from us? And then work from there, in order to best serve them.
Yeah. Well, this really reminds me of a concept that I talk about in my book. I liked it so much I created a chart for it, which is really to talk about the difference between marketing myopia and jobs
Uh-huh.
to be done.
Yep.
So marketing myopia, neither terms of which that I created, but have been heavily researched by two very different Harvard professors, actually. But marketing myopia is just so centered around your own like story, your own product features, right? Like those little pieces, like looking down at the thing that you've made or the thing that you offer. Where
Hmm.
jobs to be done is much more strategic and customer centric
Hmm.
instead of tactical and company centric. So, what is jobs to be done? Well, it's this concept that Clayton Christensen popularized in his book Competing Against Luck, and it was invented by a guy called Anthony Ulwick, who runs a consultancy called Strategen. But the concept is that we are constantly hiring and firing products and services in our lives as long as they serve our needs.
Hmm.
So let me ask you, do you need a kitchen knife that's 8 inches long, Damascus steel, 18-degree cutting angle, full take? Like, do you need a kitchen knife or do you need the ability to quickly and consistently create a healthy meal for your family?
Hmm.
Right? The job to be done is the meal. And so this knife serves a certain function and it will continue to serve that function in your life as long as it does its job. But
Hmm.
once there is another product that can do that job better, maybe I need to make a lot of salsa and I need to cut a ton of onions, right? Maybe a food processor is a better solution for the job to be done than the kitchen knife. And so in that instance, the kitchen knife gets fired. And so you think about this for brands as well, because we do talk, and I would, liken in this analogy that women are the ones that outreach. That is a product feature. But what is the job to be done that Bumble solved for? Is it empowering women? Is it helping women feel safe? Is it, right? Like there's all these more esoteric values of what Bumble's brand stands for today. And so they can continue to scale and grow and still meet the core job to be done, such as creating a safe environment for women in a dating context through other features and through the brand and through the way that they filter men and women and how they, use their algorithms to connect folks. There's other ways to meet that job to be done that maybe do need to evolve past focusing on specific product features.
Yeah, I think that that's a great way of explaining having to think about what it is that your target customer is coming to you for and how you're selling yourself to them. And I think sometimes that gets lost in this like narrative of, who we are and our mission and all that. And sometimes that ends up getting in the way of, is your customer actually happy or, with how you're providing that service? So that's why I think, these two examples for me just kind of show that like, sometimes change is good. And that, it's working for Southwest. We don't quite know if it's going to work for Bumble, but, they're at least trying, something new. And you're right. Like there are other ways for them to try to, fix the problem of their declining growth. And then this is, the way that they are doing it now after trying a variety of other ways. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Okay, cool. So a couple lessons for me are that when your differentiator is driving away your customers, it's no longer a differentiator that deserves to stay. It's you have to know what your customer is coming to you for and what their ultimate goal is. And it served its purpose, back when it was first created. It's what made it, it gave it all the headlines, right? Like this is how it was going to be different from Tinder and Hinge and all the other like dating apps. And so it did what it needed to at the time. Another lesson for me is that you can go back and change things that maybe were useful to you back when you first started. And because I've seen a lot of companies just like think that their positioning has to stay the same, throughout their growth. And it's like, no, it served its purpose when you first started and it was what it was at that time. Now that we're, where we are now, is it still serving its function? Is the positioning, is the differentiator, is our mission, our values and all that, like, are they still serving the purpose? And if they're not, then it's okay to change. And in fact, you have to. Otherwise, you're just, setting yourself up to lose. And then the third thing is that data can tell you what customers say they want, but it can't always tell you why they came to you in the first place. So this is a huge lesson, at least for me, because I thought the Southwest thing was going to fail abysmally, and it hasn't. People may say that the main reason that they came to you is that they wanted the check bags and they wanted the free, open seating. But then turns out that the people that are actually buying from you prefer the assigned seating. And at that point, you got to go where the customer is taking you, especially the ones that are paying for you. So don't get beholden to the data that says that, the main reason why they came is, the old thing. Be open to trying new things and seeing where the data takes you then, because, you might find that you are now more profitable than you were before the change.
Yeah.
Any
Well,
lessons
it's
from you?
interesting because,
Oh,
and part of the question that comes to mind is, well, what data are we referencing? So there's a framework I talk about in my book that I call the qual-quant feedback loop, qualitative and quantitative customer research, essentially. And so you always want to be leveraging both consistently. Qualitative research are non-numerical, so customer interviews, essentially. And the quantitative is the data analytics, it's the survey results, right? You leverage qualitative to understand the dimensions by which your customers care about items, and then quantitative to actually understand how important they are. And you can kind of do this for the brand as a whole, but you can continue to do this to more minute product details and features. For example, I've worked for a multi-billion-dollar e-commerce company, and we did this for the brand. And then we also did it for their loyalty program, for their mobile app, et cetera. And so it is important, right? Because the data numbers might say one thing, but the interviews may, help nudge you in a different direction that you can then rediscover what the numbers actually say around those dimensions. And we need to have enough empathy for our customers to do that, to constantly understand how important different areas are for them. My book is called Keeping People Interested, the only KPI that really matters. And the premise of the book is that in order to keep people interested, you have to be interested in them, which means having empathy, which means all the things I just talked about. And we've been discussing around adding value, understanding their deep and true needs, and actually providing value to them in those needs.
Yeah. I mean, I love that thinking because it positions marketers to be interested in their audience. That shouldn't be a novel concept. But sometimes it feels as if companies don't care about their audience or their target customer, that they're just trying to extract as much value as they can from them, without giving back or acknowledging that, they're there, they care. And then, when the audience does turn away, they're confused as to why or what they did. And it's like, well, if you look at your behavior and how you've been treating them, it would make sense why they no longer like you. So I like the idea of like continuing to be interested in your target audience, one, but then B, allowing for the change when you do have new target audience. And figuring out, are they in contrast or is it something that can grow together as your company continues growing and you get more target audiences? Awesome. Okay, so let's move on to Obama launching a book podcast. So Obama announced this week that he is launching a new podcast about books on Audible. His framing in his tweet was that at a time when fewer people are able to sit down with a book, it's important to remember the joy and power that can come from reading. He's promoting what I found interesting is that he's promoting a book podcast on a listening platform.
Right.
And yeah. And then the other thing is that like, here we go with another celebrity podcast. Cause we've been talking about here how, we've seen just a general rise in how many celebrities are turning to podcasts, not only to grow their own audience, but as a way to have conversations that they can't have anywhere else. And so I think this is super interesting, right? Like Obama, obviously, like, I mean, since he was president, has been coming out with yearly lists of his favorite music and his favorite books for the year. And there's always super popular. They always go viral. And, it's really positioned him as being a reader. And I think it's like really interesting, especially at a time when, a lot of people just aren't reading, that he continues to have that be a seminal part of who he is, but also a thing that he uses to share and relate to people on a human to human basis. So that I thought that was really interesting. The main thing here was that I thought was I guess different is that it's talking about books that have already come out and that made him who he is today, right? Like it's not going to be current books that are really coming out. It's more like a discussion that he's having with books that made him into the man that he is now, into the president, ex-president and all that. So it was, interesting to think about it as in like this isn't necessarily that he's going to be out there as like the next Reese Witherspoon or Oprah or Dua Lipa, right? Who have like a current book club that people, listen to and like interview with like the authors and stuff. But it's still more about him, which, is kind of funny because, a lot of the stuff that he does obviously is about him. And I thought that was like a unique way. It also seems as if it's only going to be 6 episodes. So I do wonder if this is going to be an ongoing thing that he has going, or if this is just kind of like a one-off, like, let me talk about the books that made me who I am and then figure out like what the next, podcast is. But yeah, did you see this, Jonathan?
Well, I think, it's interesting the areas that Obama chooses to continue to engage. right?
Hmm.
Many ex-presidents and heads of state live incredibly quiet lives after they're no longer in office. And for the most part, generally, I think Obama did as well. Now, if I were him, I would be thinking about what am I passionate about? What kind of legacy do I want to leave? And where can I make an impact, continually to society in a way that can really impact, affect future generations. And so it's interesting for him to choose reading, right, as this current
Hmm.
project. And I think it's actually pretty natural to share about books that impact you because that is a way to love and care for people, right?
Hmm.
Hey, I was so transformed by this whatever, product or lesson or quote or this person that I met. I just want to share with the world, right? Because I think that can also help you as well. I think that's actually a great place to start. Now, if he's
Hmm.
starting with just six, makes sense because he doesn't want to commit the next 20 years of his life to this. And if
Yeah.
it goes well, maybe he'll do more. But, the irony is not lost on me, where you mentioned also that, he's talking about reading more in an audio format.
Hmm.
But even then, I think it very much aligns with the principles of my book of having empathy and meeting people where they're at,
Hmm.
right? Why write a book about reading more books if people aren't reading books? I read the Hunger Games books only after watching the movies, and
Hmm.
both of them enriched my life in different ways, right? And so I do think it makes sense to meet people where they're at. And if people have time for audiobooks, and that's what will get them engaged, but may pique their interest into this deeper engagement with this concept of reading full on paper books, I actually think that's a pretty wise and strategic decision.
It's also less commitment on his part, right? I mean, he has the experience of having written two other books. He knows what the process is.
Hmm.
Pretty sure that it came out that when Michelle Obama wrote, I say quote unquote because she had a ghostwriter write it. It came out that he had actually written his books. So he obviously knows how long that takes. But then also to, second what you're saying, that because people aren't reading, we do know that they are listening to podcasts more and more. And obviously, he already has a well established audience of people that are interested in him, interested in his life, interested in his book selections on a yearly basis. That this would be of interest to that demographic of people. And I'm sure there'll be all sorts of other people that don't usually listen to podcasts that, are there purely to hear him talk. I think, he's one of the finest talkers out there, a great orator. So, imagine just listening to Obama talk about like his book. I mean, he did the audiobook versions of his own books. So, which I've listened to. That's like, obviously a natural place for him to go. I think it's also interesting that the Obama Center Presidential Library opened up this year. So obviously he now has a bit of more time on his hands. And I think like you said, it is interesting that this is what he's focusing on, the reading and the intellect, right? He's always obviously valued that throughout his life and through the presidency. And I think it's great that at a time when we are seeing people not read as much, actually, I did see that today. Book sales have gone up this past year, which is pretty cool. Um, but it is good to kind of, bring back reading as a thing that people enjoy as a hobby, and having those types of discussions. I do look forward to, seeing what it is that he says, not just about, his own personal life, but how it fits into his worldview and how the rest of us can maybe learn a little bit more from that at a time when it does feel as if not everybody is as close as you would want us to be. Okay, so a couple lessons for me are that a celebrity cosign has now replaced the institution as a credible engine for cultural products. So what that means is that we're seeing more and more celebrities come out and talk about the things that they like, books, movies, and have those be recommendations that they put out there. And this is, that's been solidified with, Reese Witherspoon and her book club, Oprah, obviously, Dua Lipa. There's lots more. I heard that, Kaya Gerber has her own. So we're seeing more celebrities kind of put out there the things that they enjoy. And here we have one of the biggest celebrities now who has, I guess, found it safe enough to be, putting this out there and not be seen as icky. Um, I don't know like how to explain, like where it's like beneath him to like do this. I think about this because we have, this kind of, it called to mind the whole Meghan Markle and Harry, Prince Harry, wanting to do like the Netflix show and like a podcast and stuff, but then actually never really doing much with it, right? Like Meghan Markle had her like interview show, and she did it for a little bit, but then it kind of just, went away. And I wonder if they had done more of a like this, where it's like a closed capsule, like we're just talking about these 6 books and may come back for like a different podcast like later, whether it would have been more effective than try to have like an ongoing, like, interview show. So I think it is interesting that, Obama didn't choose to do a like interview show per se, much like we're seeing other like celebrity podcasts do, but he's doing something that fits within his brand and like the way that he is perceived by us, right? Where it's like it's still about him, but he is putting his life and the things that interest him in the context of things that interest him. So for marketers, like what are these things that like make sense for your brand to do, right? Like it's not enough to just do a podcast show, do like an interview podcast show because everybody's doing them, but does it actually fit with how you want to portray yourself? And does it fit with your brand? A lot of companies right now, it's just like, it seems like, the thing to do is just to start a podcast without really thinking about like, well, is this actually what people want from us? Are we actually going to get, our audience to listen to us? And do they want this type of content? Or is there another type of content that we could be creating for them that will bring them to us a little bit more? And I think that this kind of, shows that there are ways to think about, what everybody's doing, a podcast, but putting it in the context of your own personal brand that fits much better with like the audience that you're targeting.
Yeah. No, I often think about even, where do we apply our own efforts? And it's this, great intersection of what the world needs, what we're passionate about, and what we can sustainably make money, make a living doing. Right. Now, Obama's
Mhm.
got, I'm sure, plenty of money. So he's
Yeah.
trying to find that intersection, I think, of,
Yeah.
what does the world need and what is he passionate about in this moment that he can apply himself to? I think that's a good story for brands too. Right. Value proposition is the customer's need and what value you can add to their lives, right? And in that third circle, in a sustainable way that makes you money, right? I think that's actually a very important, consideration when thinking about launching new products or services is
Mhm.
how are you actually meeting needs with the core of who you are and what you're actually good at and what is the reason to believe that you are the one who can actually provide that value.
Yeah, I mean, there obviously is some monetary decisions that went into this, right? Because he went with Audible as opposed to, going Substack, direct to people or just like launching a podcast with like a podcast partner. So that is another thing that is interesting where it's like it's still tying it to like a book brand. So moving on to the last topic. So the FAA hired gamers as air traffic controllers, which I think is like super interesting to think about how, for two reasons. One is this whole idea that like, video gaming was, meant to be this like, I don't know, this thing that like our parents tried to like get us to not do. And here we go where it's become like, a way to get a job because of the skills that you developed being a gamer. And I think it's also a way of showing that like thinking about skills and like upskilling and transferring those into a context that actually makes sense when you are open to like ideas, right? So, we do have to give a shout out here to Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, who used a recruiting video to target video gamers directly in order to get to their hiring goal of hiring more than 2,000 air traffic controllers and having 2,000 more in the pipeline. Because I mean, as of a couple months ago, we were hearing that like there weren't enough people coming up through the air traffic controller pipeline or who had the skills or wanted to learn because people just didn't think of that as a job. And so they used And so and so when they learned that gamers had the skills that they needed, they went directly to go target them. And here we are with, this like success story. And I think that this is such a good story to think about in the context of AI that we were talking about earlier. Cause like, what are these skills, these baseline skills that you can take that people are investing in, on their own time, right? Usually you're gaming as like a hobby. It's not like you're on Twitch streaming or something. Um, and then take those skills and put them into a context that like actually works for the job that needs to be done. So I'm seeing both sides where, some of the replies are like super impressed that they have been able to do this, and other ones are terrified because it's like, are we really giving, gamers these like jobs that are like meant to be, important? But I think it was like really interesting because a lot of what the narrative was saying is that the reason why gamers are so good at this is because they can make quick decisions, and they're able to like see things in a variety of contexts that like don't that usually most people don't have to like think about, right? Whereas like, when you think about what it requires to be an air controller, it's like, oh yeah, the overlap makes sense
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
like, what it is that they do. So have you seen this, Jonathan? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, this is another, I think, just great example of what would be a forum and an analogy to marketing myopia versus job to be done. Like, what are the
Mhm,
product features of candidates? Right? We often think about their features as the bachelor's degree and the GPA that they got.
mhm,
But would you want the star athlete who did great in college to be an air traffic controller if they can't stand sitting around and staring at a screen for 8 hours a day? Right? Like,
yeah,
what actually is the job to be done? And I
yeah.
played a lot of video games growing up, and my parents and I actually always joked about how it made me so good at some of the things that I am good at
Mhm,
because it taught, critical thinking, solving puzzles, hand-eye coordination, and bringing along these other soft features of, for an air traffic controller, again, the capacity to sit in front of a screen for a long time while still maintaining focus and making important decisions. I mean, that really is a clever and perfect fit, I think.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think another thing here too is how often we hear how difficult it is for government agencies to hire people, and
Mhm.
how long it takes, um, because there's so many hoops that you have to jump through. You have to get your profiles to be written in a way that makes sense for like government jobs as opposed to other jobs that you're applying for. So it seems as this like kind of bypass that by um targeting the skills that they need most, spatial reasoning and split attention skills, that the job actually requires, and going direct to an audience that already has that. So I think, it's super interesting as a marketing campaign to think about what are these types of distribution channels that we have or that we can look for, that will help us target our audience a little bit better than trying to, spray and pray, right? Which never really works. So I think that's like, an interesting thing. And it's a rare example of the government, matching the job requirements to a non-obvious talent pool. And it's funny because we've talked about this, not talked about this, but I've seen these stories in terms of like, gamers helping out with like the military. But this, seems a far, without this having to be like they're, out there, using drones or whatever, which also is specialized skills. You don't have to sign up to go to the military. You can just be an air traffic controller, right? So I think this is a really cool way to, get in front of people that you necessarily wouldn't have otherwise, and recognizing, how skilled, these people actually are. And yeah, I don't get, it gives me hope for the future, where it's like, are there other examples that we could be doing this for that we're just not seeing, because we're, thinking too narrowly or have like blinders on about, skills and stuff.
Right. And again, bringing it back to the very beginning, AI and some of the fears of it taking people's jobs. Are we as a society just not creative enough to find the right kinds of jobs for the right kinds of people who actually would really benefit from a change in what they're currently doing. And
Mhm.
so it's another reason to be optimistic if we only had the creativity and the optimism to find, the roles that bring life to us that add value to the world as well.
Yeah. Just thinking about it in the context of AI, where it's like, this would be kind of a use case to use for AI, where it's like we kind of dissects down to like the marrow the actual important skills that we need for particular jobs, and then cross research other jobs that have similar requirements, and then use that to then go and like target, right? I often think about how this whole idea of we need to retrain people to like have the skills that we need them for in this like digital economy. And sometimes it's easier to go to places that are already interested in that, right? They already have those, they've built it up themselves because they've been, naturally curious about it because they're gamers. And look, what a great fit that is. And like, what other examples are there that, could be done in this way, using AI? Both in terms of just regular jobs that already exist, but then also in thinking about new ways that we could be using AI to help us. And then the human AI, pairing up to enhance both abilities. So a couple takeaways for, for the whole episode are that the gap between your stated values and your actual behavior can be an expensive PR problem. So that's kind of, what I was seeing with Zuckerberg talking about AI as like a democratic platform and wanting to open it up to everybody, paired up against how they act on a daily basis with Meta and Facebook and Instagram, particularly with like all their court cases. So it's one thing to, have nice messaging about like what you want the future to look like. But then if you're going around and acting the opposite in, how you relate to, in how your main company and your main business function is actually working, then you're going to get questioned. And that's one thing that like, to think about, like, are your values actually aligning with what you're saying you're doing? Or do you need to, look at both and see what needs to be fixed? For now, I think it works for him to have a big vision view of the world in terms of AI because it is still new. But he should also expect people to take it with a grain of salt because of everything that's happened with Meta and Facebook. And another one is that that we're seeing with Southwest and Bumble is that your differentiator can become detrimental to you and your product, especially if your consumer is not actually coming to you for that reason and want something bigger from you. So um, we'll see what happens with Bumble, but seeing what happened with Southwest gives me, hope, or I'm a bit optimistic that it'll work out in their favor, because I don't think that, women reaching out to men was the main reason why their target customer was coming to them. And then for the last one is that um, skills based framing is always a better story than credentials based framing. Um, so the fact that they, hired gamers is the headline, but what, we actually see behind the scenes is like how they were able to create a targeted marketing campaign for the type of skills that they needed. So think about like, what are these ways that we can find other, to find target, audiences that want our product or service that might not see it in that way until you talk about it in a way that puts their skills and like their attributes in a way that like makes sense to them. And I think that that's what really worked out here, where it's like you're targeting these people saying like, we're looking for people that have spatial awareness and that can make quick time decisions, and recognizing that video games do that, and then going out and targeting them specifically and having that be, super successful because they see themselves in how you're targeting them, and not just, another government job that, isn't cool for them. Any takeaways from you?
Yeah, it's just it's for me, it always just comes down to value creation. When you think about business and marketing and, job alignment or AI, whatever it is. And so I see in these various stories with the application of, a more open AI framework down to, opening up your product feature and not being so limited with Bumble, and to even like selling the product of a job to a specific target audience, right? Of gamers. I think that's the magic that it takes a human to really do well, is to find that intersection of the job to be done, the problem to be solved, and the value that a particular organization can add, and then leveraging the right kind of targeting, the right kind of messaging. You can call that all marketing, you can call that branding, you can call it whatever you want. But it's how do you get the right message in front of the right person at the right time in a way that helps them realize that your service is going to make their life better.
Mhm.
And so again, I think all this comes down to value creation, and it's fun to take a look at the various stories and what's going on in the world. And I definitely try to take an optimistic view on what's to come.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn pretty actively, but my website is jonathanklow.com, JONATHANKLO.com. You can find links to my social media. I'm on TikTok there at Jonathan K. Lowe. Got a newsletter around strategic frameworks, and you can find my book there as well.
Awesome. And then you can follow me at Sonia Bashez everywhere, and the podcast at Meme Team Pod on YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok. Thank you. See you next week.